It's here that the kind of might, I guess we want to call it that, of the Japanese forces is felt. We have the introduction of the airplane, the Mitsubishi. I may be misspelling this, sorry. Zero. Okay, the fighter plane. You can take a look at things on YouTube. There's a ton of those, greatest aircrafts of World War II. I'm sure the Zero comes in very highly. Um, but you see this, it's a much lighter aircraft than anything the United States have. It's faster, it has a tighter turn ratio, and it's really, by and large, it's really as far as warplanes go at the time, it's top notch. Okay, again, like with World War II in Europe, the United States will eventually catch up, but the United States' aircraft at the beginning of World War II in the Pacific in 1941 are very far behind anything the Japanese have. Not to mention the Japanese carrier pilots have much more experience than the few carrier pilots that the United States has, right? So when the war breaks out, Japan is really has quite the advantage. Now the thing is, the United States knows that this is coming. They know an attack is coming. They had broken the Japanese code through something called magic. Problem is, they didn't know where it was coming or specifically when. There's always a lot of talk that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the United States president at the time, knew about the attack, knew when it was coming, knew where it was coming, and let it happen anyway because he wanted to use that as an excuse to get America in the war and break American neutrality. There's really no evidence for this. Like I said, they knew something was going to happen. They didn't know where. They didn't know when. Okay. So, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and again, I guess if we were going to talk about turning points in the war, Pearl Harbor would be a huge one. It brings the United States into the war, not only against Japan, but against Germany as well. It also, for all of its successes in sinking and damaging many of the battleships and cruisers, it fails to get the carriers. And it's going to be the carriers, when this war really gets going after December 7th, 1941 into 42, it's going to be the carriers that are going to be the main actors in this war. So the United States still has some. They're still outnumbered, like 10-3 in carriers, but they still have their carriers. And again, the Japanese failed to take Pearl Harbor. So that could be a big turning point. I would actually argue it's probably a huge turning point. Maybe the hugest turning point in the war that there is. I don't know. But if we see how this attack plays out, then they turn then towards the southern resources area. Okay? And what we essentially have are two main thrusts, right? Southwest, down the Malayan Peninsula, which is right here. Sorry. Malaya right here, so southwest down this way. Into Burma right here. Into the Dutch East Indies, which is right here, Sumatra, Java, Borneo. Okay, these would all been Dutch colonies before World War II. Second drive would then be carried out southeasterly into the Philippines. So right here. So we have one drive going down this way and towards Burma, right? Another drive going towards the Philippines and the other end of the Dutch East Indies right here. And then subsidiary drives towards into the Marianas Islands, Guam, Wake, and the Gilberts right here. Okay, and the idea is to cut the, and then set up this defensive line. And again, here's the southern resources area. All right, and this southern resources area invasion, had three goals. Number one, destroy Allied power in the Western Pacific, right here. Number two, cut off any aid to China that's coming through Burma and India by the Allies and isolate them. And number three, again, create this defensive line to hold off against the Americans. Pretty standard military doctrine, I guess. Seems like it to me. December, just after Pearl Harbor, they attack the city of Hong Kong, which is a British colony right there. February 1942, they advanced into Burma, from French Indochina, down the Malayan Peninsula, to the point where they are threatening what is known as Fortress Singapore. Okay, Malaya was a British colony prior to World War II, and the British themselves had really fortified this area right here, Singapore, okay, in the South China Sea. Here's the problem. So this peninsula right here, known as the Malayan Peninsula, where the Japanese are coming down, is all jungle, right? This is not easy terrain to traverse. The British understand this, and they don't seem to be worried about an overland invasion. What they consider the biggest threat is a seaborne invasion aimed at Singapore. So all their guns, all their defenses in the city of Singapore are pointing out this way. They got nothing pointing back this way. And just a couple of weeks, the Japanese army, sometimes on bicycles, small unit tactics, some armor, is able to penetrate through these jungle using these trails and stuff, and they take Singapore basically from the rear. This is February 1942. They also sink two British ships, the HMS Wales and the HMS Repulse. The reason I bring this up is with the sinking of the Wales and the Repulse and the fall of Singapore, Fortress Singapore, British power in the Pacific is basically wiped out. And for the rest of the war, they're going to be basically confined to this kind of China, Burma, India theater. Finally, they take the Philippines. In May of 42, they take the Dutch East Indies as well. And they begin to drive towards New Guinea, which is the other end of these Dutch East Indies. And the idea is they want to cut Australia off from any aid from the United States, with the goal of eventually invading Australia. By May of 42, they had established their defensive perimeter, which encompassed territory from the Aleutian Islands here, which is U.S. territory from Japan, all the way to New Guinea in the south. They had established their thing almost all the way to Midway Island in the east and almost to India in the west. So they've, within just a couple months' time, say 5 months, they've carried out and accomplished almost everything they set out to do with this invasion of the Southern Resources area. But at this point, 42, we're going to begin to see a lot of turning points. Okay, so these turning points in the Pacific, quite a few of them here. We'll kind of go through them. It's at least these first three right here. Okay, the Doolittle Raid, Battle of the Coral Sea, and the Battle of Midway. All right, so turning points. The failure to destroy the U.S. aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor, which was, one of the main aims of the attack, leads to three pivotal events. The first one, the Doolittle Raid, April 1942. So just really 5 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. U.S. war planners, naval planners, at the behest of President Roosevelt, who really wanted to have something to show the American public that we were in this fight, that the United States was in the fight, it was hitting back, it was capable of some kind of a counterattack to Pearl Harbor. So they had planned what's known as the Doolittle Raid. Now, it's commanded by a guy named James Doolittle, so that's the name of it. But it kind of also got this little moniker as the Doolittle Raid because it did very little, but it actually did more than people give it credit for. So essentially, it's a raid, bombing raid against the city of Tokyo, so the capital of Japan, which is, it's interesting and it's important because the Japanese emperor had promised the Japanese people that not one American bomb would fall on the homeland. And this, within 5 months, it's already happening. So what happens is B-25 bombers placed on carriers are ferried across the Pacific to within bombing range of Tokyo. They take off, which in and of itself is a huge event. Taking a B-25 or launching a B-25 bomber off of a aircraft carrier is a feat that few have ever tried. And they make it. The problem is with the Doolittle raid is they don't have enough fuel to get back. So what they have to do is try to get to China, where they'll land on friendly bases on the interior of China. Some make it. A lot of them end up ditching in the sea. So this B-25 raid bombs Tokyo. They do very little damage, so check the Doolittle raid, right? Does very little. But, again, it's a morale booster for the United States. And secondly, it leads the Japanese military, especially the naval planners, to realize that they have to get these carriers. They can't let them continue on in the fight because you're going to get things like this Doolittle raid. So that's number one. Not really a turning point, but it's leading to this turning point here, the Battle of Midway. Second event, May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japanese carrier forces sent to secure the Coral Sea, which is down by Australia. The thing is they're going to take Port Moresby on the tip of New Guinea, and then they're going to be able to have a foothold in New Guinea, which will then allow them to cut Australia off from US aid, like I said before. It's really the first purely aerial naval battle. Ends in a draw. Okay, so basically what it is the United States sends its couple of carriers that are such a small force. They send them to the Coral Sea to intercept these Japanese carriers. They fight out a battle, but it's purely aerial. Okay, so planes from the Japanese carriers try to find the U.S. carriers and sink them, while planes from the U.S. carrier or the Japanese carriers look for the American carriers and try to sink them. Again, the battle ends in a draw. Nothing really major. One of the aircraft carriers is damaged, but the U.S. aircraft carrier is damaged. It limps back to port, and it's actually fixed and ready to go just a month later when they have the Battle of Midway Island. So it ends in a draw, but it really convinces Yamamoto that he needs to draw out and destroy the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. So this, Coral Sea, and the Doolittle raid lead to the Battle of Midway because they've convinced Japanese military planners that they have to destroy the remnants of these American carriers, or they're never going to have any type of security in their kind of East Asian co-prosperity sphere. So Yamamoto begins planning the Battle of Midway. The idea is that Yamamoto is going to attack Midway Island, which if we go back to the map, is right here. So it covers the approaches to the Hawaiian Islands, right? It's terribly strategically important for the United States. If they lose Midway, which is an American base, they would then open themselves up to land-based bombers from Midway Island. So you can't really be having that too much. So Yamamoto says, if I basically come out here and attack this, the U.S. are going to have to send whatever's left of their fleet, especially their carriers, out here to meet me and stop me. And when they do that, I am going to destroy them, sink them, and then we will be good to go. Here's the problem. American code breakers had figured out what was going on. They had used what we talked about before, magic. So they knew the Japanese plans, and they know the attack plan. And the new commander of the American fleet in the Pacific, Chester W. Nimitz, also known as CINC-PAC, Commander-in-Chief Pacific, plans his own surprise, right? So he knows what's coming, he knows when it's coming, he knows where it's coming. So he appoints a guy named Admiral Raymond Spruance to lead the task force of aircraft carriers that's going to come out and spring their own trap against the Japanese as they attack Midway Island. He's placed in charge of two task forces, Task Forces 16 and 17, and it will be their job to go about 300 miles to the north of the island and await the Japanese. After Japanese planes attacked Midway, they returned and they refuel and they reload. Basically, they figured that the original attack against Midway, using using munitions that are basically designed to blow up land-based targets like airfields, etc., didn't work. So they're going to have to come back, refuel, re-outfit with these bombs that are used against land targets, and then fly back and do another attack. Meanwhile, the U.S. fleet, with their reconnaissance planes, had located the Japanese fleet. They send an attack to them, but the problem is the attack is not coordinated. They attack in waves rather than all at once. And just a quick how this works, right? So U.S. doctrine when it came to bombers, to naval warfare, was to essentially how U.S. naval air doctrine works is you would have what they call coordinated attack. So on every carrier, you had three types of aircraft. You had a torpedo bomber, you had dive bombers, and then you had fighter planes. The idea was that your fighter planes would fly above the fleet on what they call cap, right? So they're patrolling, waiting for enemy airplanes to come in and target their carriers. While that was happening, the torpedo bombers and the dive bombers were supposed to form up over the carrier fleet in a group. They were supposed to then take off. They were supposed to find the enemy, which had already been located, usually by one of these PBY Catalina planes. And they would attack the enemy fleet at the same time. So dive bombers would come in low over the water, over the waves. The way the torpedo bombers were designed is they had to fly very low and they had to fly very slow, or if they dropped their torpedo in the water at too fast or too great a height, it would either break up or it would dive down to the bottom and wouldn't work. So you had to come in very low and very slow, which made these things huge targets. The idea then was, while they were doing that, the dive bombers would attack from above, and since this would be coordinated, the enemy fleet would have no choice but to either take out the torpedo planes, take out the dive bombers, and the hopes was that in their confusion they would be able to do neither. And now don't forget that in the midst of all this, enemy fighter planes, Japanese planes, would be attacking them as well. So the attack comes, it's not coordinated at all. Torpedo planes from the torpedo squadron number 8 attack first, and they are completely wiped out. All right. The problem is with that for the Japanese is it had brought their Japanese, the Zeros that were flying the patrol over the Japanese fleet down, to the water level, right, when they're supposed to be flying high. So they're out of position because, these aren't jets. These are prop, gasoline, aviation fuel planes. So they can't just zip right back up to the top in a second or two like an F-15 could. It's going to take them a while of circling and getting back into place to maneuver. While they're doing that, here comes the dive bombers attacking. And what the problem is for the Japanese on their carriers here is they were in the midst of refueling and reloading again, because once they had decided that they had to have a second attack on Midway Island and they brought all the bombs out, they had then gotten word of the American carrier force and decided they had to take them out instead. So Nagumo decides that rather than going back to Midway to attack, he's going to rearm the planes right on the deck of the carrier. So he's going to switch from bombs to torpedoes and dive bombing bombs. Now, so they're going to switch off the bombs, put on the torpedoes, and then they're going to go sink the U.S. fleet. So I think the easiest, one of the better ways to do this is to show you the documentary from 20th Century Battlefields, The Battle of Midway.
In the summer of 1942, these two tiny islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, west of Hawaii, were at the heart of an epic battle. Fought between the navies of Japan and the United States, it was a battle that decisively altered the course of the Second World War. Japan was intent on using its navy to expand its power in the Pacific, and it had an ambitious plan to destroy the main obstacle standing in its way, the Navy of the United States of America. The battle they fought marked the coming of age of a new type of warfare at sea. It was a duel to the death, in which aircraft carriers and their warplanes played the pivotal role. I'll be revealing how victory or defeat hung on the snap decisions of American and Japanese commanders. And I'll be exploring the tactics they used as they unleashed these new weapons of war.
The decisions made by the pilots and crews on both sides were also critical. I'll be revealing the terrifying risks they took as they fought and died out there in the vast reaches of the Pacific Ocean. And I'll be experiencing some of the horrific conditions they endured in the heat of battle.
This titanic struggle was decided in 5 minutes of unimaginable destruction. 5 minutes that turned the balance of power in the Pacific upside down and transformed the rules of war at sea. It was the Battle of Midway.